Law a normal thing for you to get into? Was your dad involved in that? Any family members?
My mom was a legal secretary for many years with one of the better firms in town in Peru, Indiana. So growing up, I hung out there a lot, obviously, but I really never thought about it. Don't forget, this is the 60s, and I went off to school at Purdue in I graduated in 1967. So I went to Purdue and graduated there in 72. I missed a year because I dropped out and went to France to study for some time there. Then came back, finished up. What do you do now? Well, I know some French. Peace Corps. My older brother was one of the original Peace Corps cadres, trained at Syracuse, that President Kennedy started, and it was under then Sergeant Shriver. And so he went to, at the time, it was called Tanganyika, and learned Swahili, and I always thought that was the best thing. And so my time came, and I said, I want to join the Peace Corps, and so I did, and I was assigned to go to Morocco. I said I needed a French-speaking country, so that's where I went. They sent me to Morocco, and I spent 2 years there. Came back, I was unemployed for a while, lived in Buffalo, then my wife got a job as the director of the daycare in Westfield at the Presbyterian Church. So I went up to the county, did the interview rounds, and eventually the public defender's office needed someone.
You weren't a lawyer at this point, no?
No, they needed someone to go to the jail to do interviews.
Okay.
And to type up the interviews and give them to the attorneys and just help out, opening files with the office administration, stuff like that. And at the time,
who was your boss?
Well, Bill Arison hired me, and Ron Gibb was the first assistant public defender then, so he was kind of running the office at the time. I think Bill was, as a part-time public defender, he was being paid like $18,000. I got a job as called a researcher typist. Eventually segued into an investigator trial assistant, but I got big bucks then. I got $6,000. So I spent about 2.5 years there doing a lot of jail interviews, talking to the defendants. Our part-time investigator had left, and we had another part-time investigator that came in, but I ended up doing a lot of that too, so I worked with him a lot, especially down here in Jamestown, going down all the bars. There were a lot of bars. There were a lot of bars in Jamestown back in, I started in end of 75. And then Ed Fagan came in 76 as public defender. And then Richard Slater came in as public defender in 78. And so I got to work with those guys. And both very good trial attorneys. So sitting in, watching this, I'm thinking, I can do this.
Just out of curiosity, for the camera, how would the file would come in? Obviously, somebody's been accused of a crime. They couldn't pay for their own attorneys. They are assigned to the public defenders.
Right.
And then you just rattled off a list of people you worked for, from Bill Arison to Fagan to Slater. They get the file, and do they give you questions, or is it your job to go out and interview the accused and then
I follow up?
Yeah.
Normally you interview the accused in the jail. I mean, I pretty much had the run of the jail. They'd let me in. They knew who I was. I'd go from cell block to cell block. Then I'd ask one of the guards to put so-and-so in the interview room, and so then I'd write down their story, and then if I have to, follow up. But then you get names of victims, you have witnesses, potential witnesses, so you had to run those down as well. And family members, keep in contact with family members and all that. So yeah, it was a great learning job as far as learning about the human condition and the types of characters and individuals that there are in the world.
Talk about characters. Were you asked to get involved with Kelvin of Oakland at all?
No. That was no, because I'm thinking, if I recall, I don't think our office represented him.
Okay, that could be.
Because I think, if it did, I was not a part of that. A lot of these cases, I would have to maintain business, ongoing business of other cases and everything, and those were being played out upstairs in the county courtroom and everything.
Did you sit in on a lot of the cases?
Eventually my title became a trial assistant, and so I prepped the files for the attorneys, did the investigations, had everything ready to go. I helped with jury selection. I watched Bill Arison do hearings. I watched Paul King do trials. I watched Ed Fagan do trials, Richard Slater. It was a great position for me to be in. And then I left and I worked as an investigator paralegal for Brandt and Laughlin down in Westfield, and they had offices in Fredonia, Westfield, and Mayville. Great firm, great guys to work for, and they primarily had a good PI business going, so I was doing the investigations on that as well as helping out in the office with other stuff, research and all that. And I remember talking to Tony Caprino once, who was the investigator in the DA office at the time. And I was musing to him about, well, you know, Tony, I'd like to go, maybe I don't know if I should go to law school or if maybe I should just get my my investigator's license and just open up a little practice like that. And I still remember him going, Paul, he said, who would you rather be? The guy who gets called out in the middle of the night to go to a scene, or the guy who calls that guy in the middle of the night to go to the scene? and I always thought about that. And you know, I worked a year or two with Brandt and Laughlin, and Bob Laughlin really put the pressure on me, made me go to law school. And so I sold the house up in DeWittville after spending a few blizzards up there, and then went off, came back 3 years later, and got hired by Fagan and Sheffield.
Where'd you go to?
I went to University of Akron.
Yeah.
It was, I'd been accepted at Syracuse, but it was like 4 hours away and a lot more money than even out-of-state tuition in Akron. And Akron was only 3 hours away. And we always wanted to come back to the area. I mean, my wife was from Dunkirk and had a lot of close connections there and everything. So we ended up here, and it was the best choice we ever made.
So from then you came back to Fagan and Sheffield.
Spent about 2.5 years with them doing a lot of defense work. I remember my first trial. It was a jury trial in Ellicott, and it was a DWI, and I admitted intoxication to the jury. He was drunk, but he wasn't operating his car, and they apparently agreed with me, and so I said, anyway, I can do this. But yeah, it was interesting times then, and then
By the way, just you mentioned, again, dropping names, people like, because you're a source, you're an observer of those early public defenders.
correct.
And you mentioned 4 names, 3 public defenders and Paul King. What were their styles? Could you describe a Bill Arison style of, Ed Fagan style, a Richard Slater style?
Probably, if I don't want to get sued for defamation. No, they all had their own styles, and they were all very effective. And ironically, I had trials against them when I became an assistant DA. I would have trials against them either in county court or out in town court. And just knowing their styles didn't make it any easier for me, because they were very effective. And Bill Arison was the type of guy, he was really good with questioning the police officers on the stand, and he would give them a hard question and they'd kind of stutter around and everything, and then as he was leaving them, he'd wink at them or something like that, just to make them know that, hey, sorry about that, but I had to ask. And Ed was very, very direct and could be brusque at times, but that was part of his style. Ed was a good, aggressive defense attorney, and Richard was as well. And so they each had their own style that really was effective, and a lot of times got good results. I still remember at the time when Ed was appointed public defender, he had just lost to Paul King in the DA race, and he'd just been out of law school for about 3 years, had worked in Wall Street in New York, and came up, and then he was working in the county attorney's office. And Leetown Adams, Judge Adams, would not assign him criminal cases. There's a big hubbubaloo about that, and because he didn't think he was that experienced. Eventually, Ed defended this guy charged with burglary up in Dunkirk at the Columbus Club, and he did such a great job. At the end, after Judge Adams had dismissed the jury and was just getting up to walk off the bench, he turned to the defendant and said, "So-and-so, your attorney did a good job for you. He almost had me believing that you didn't do it." And the defendant said, "Yeah, me too." And Paul Keating was writing that down, and it was still in the record because the judge had not yet left the bench.
Wow. That's great. I'm looking at a case that I wondered if you were involved at all with Fillmore Scruggs.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, because we did that a few years ago. We talked about that. Yeah.
For the camera, just give a little background, and what's your observations of that story?
Sad story. 19-year-old girl in Erie becomes a prostitute for Scruggs. He lives in Erie. She does something he doesn't like. He kills her and dumps her body up in Westfield along the railroad tracks. So the body is found. So it was quite an investigation. First of all, finding out who she is and everything. We're not involved until they do a joint investigation with the Erie police, and it comes back, and they charge Fillmore Scruggs. He was maybe in his 60s or so. He was a crusty guy. He was not a nice guy, and I had to deal with him in the jail, taking his story and everything. He didn't trust me. He didn't like me, but still, I got what I could. And Bruce Carpenter represented him, and so it went to trial. That was the trial that John Ward did, because Paul King had just unfortunately had died I think in May of '77 from a tragic accident. And our only defense was that the murder did not occur in Chautauqua County. In fact, that it had occurred in Erie at his apartment on Parade Street. So at that time, Lefty Nelson is a part-time investigator in the office, and he was had been a Jamestown officer, and so he and I spent some time down there, and the Westfield police, Paul Case and Chief Black, they're pursuing leads and investigations in conjunction with the Erie police. Little do they know, Lefty has a contact in the Erie Police Department. I can say this now because the statute has run everything. And we meet the contact at the time it was a Holiday Hotel right there near State Street on 90. He has the file. I'm going, oh, okay. So Lefty chats with the contact, and I'm there on the bed just taking notes and everything. And the police could not figure out how we knew everything right then and there. We were just one step behind him all the way down the line. And still didn't look good for Fillmore, though. And in order to show that and create reasonable doubt that this court did not have any jurisdiction because everything had occurred over in Erie County, Bruce was able to get Scruggs to tell him exactly where he killed the girl. And I, at that time, he told me to go over. I created a subpoena because we knew there were new tenants there. And I think Perry Colburn was the county clerk at the time. Either that or, I can't remember, it was Steve Carlson or Perry. But I got some gold seals, just put them all over the subpoena, and I went down with Bob Kokersberger, who was the chemistry professor at JCC, and got entry and went to the spot, pulled the rug up, went to the spot. He did a test, a field test, to show that there was presence of blood, okay? Now, we don't know what kind of blood. Back then, we didn't have DNA or anything like that, so we were able to talk the tenant into giving us the rug. Now, this was a living room rug. We had to roll it up, and somehow I got it in my car. And at the time, I was living in DeWittville, and I show up at the house with this bloody rug because I have to keep it to take, because we're going to transport it to Buffalo, to UB, and have it tested and all that. My wife was not happy, but I got it out the next day, got it up to UB, and they did testing and showed that it was human blood, and they had even they could do an antigen test for it and everything. So we did that, and then Bruce Carpenter had, during the trial, had to do an offer of proof to try and get that in. And you could just tell Judge Adams was not going to let that happen. And I had to testify, and just to show the chain and everything. And yeah, you know, you're on that witness stand, you're quite uncomfortable and everything, but the judge made his ruling out of the presence of the jury, and so then the case continued. During one of the recesses, Fillmore was walking by Tony Caprino, and he didn't like Tony at all. He didn't like anybody, but he especially didn't like Tony. And he jumped him. He attacked him. You know, so we're just pulling him off and everything, all that. So afterwards, he's convicted, and I was not there, but this was the story that everybody was saying. When he was sentenced, he turns and looks up at Leetown when Leetown asks him if he has anything he wishes to say before he's sentenced. And he goes into this long thing about how he wished there was no death penalty how he wished there was a death penalty in New York State. So when he walks down that long hallway and they set him in that chair and they put the bands on him and everything, and when they throw that switch that, "You, Judge, aren't sitting there in my lap." So, and then he's sentenced, and thought that was the end of that, and it was. But then the appellate division reversed because of some deficiency that happened over in Erie County, over in Erie, PA, and so with the police investigation over there. So, and John had indicated this in that one seminar. He had to let the family know and how it was a bad timing. And then they find out that Fillmore had been dead for 1.5 years.
Oh my gosh.
So, he died in prison. So that was
Were you involved in Sawyer?
Yeah. To the extent that I spoke with him in the jail, I did not feel comfortable enough speaking with him in an interview room. And then at that time, I got sent out to the barn where everything was found, and I asked permission, and I went in and photographed just the general area, all the lottery tickets, the gun, everything that was taken from Hogan's hut was found in a cubbyhole in the barn. And basically I took pictures then. Really didn't have anything else to do with him, except then eventually he was tried. Leetown made him defend himself. That was reversed on appeal. And then the DA office was disqualified because I think at that time then Ron Gibb, who had been in the public defender's office, had gone over. So Dalton Burgett was appointed. Kevin Laumer then was public defender, and he ended up defending him. Venue was changed up to Judge Frederick Marshall in Erie County in Buffalo. So everything occurred up there. So for my 2 hours of taking those pictures, I ended up, I think, testifying 2 or 3 times up in Buffalo. But then he was convicted, and just a few years ago we learned he died. He died in prison.
You said you weren't comfortable being in an interview room with him. Was that a fear factor?
Yeah, for myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, his attitude, his body language, his eyes. By this time, I was able to judge. Well, I got caught one time, but I was able to judge how I could feel comfortable. And a lot of times I would talk to him just through the bars down at the end, and where no one could hear us anyway, and everything. So, yeah, the one time I got caught was with George Semenuk. I don't know if...
Heard the name.
Yeah, he stabbed his girlfriend over in Lincoln Street here. And that's actually was Ed Fagan's first big trial. And he did a great job and got a manslaughter conviction. But before then, and we'd put on a mental disease and defect, and before then, I'd go over and I'd visit with George, and then for one reason, they locked me in an interview room with him. And so I was talking to him. All of a sudden, he goes into a psychotic episode, and you can just see it come into his eyes, everything. And then he gets down, and he starts doing push-ups, and he kept saying, "The devil made me stab her. the devil made me stab her. And I'm over at the door yelling, saying, get me out of here. And it was just amazing how that episode just occurred like that. Yeah.
So they're, unlike Hollywood, when they have this interviews and there's always in the background somebody standing who's a guard or some. I assume that's not reality.
That wasn't then. Don't forget, it was, mid 70s or so, and later 70s, 76 or so.
You had to make a judgment call when you were going to go in and meet the accused.
Most of the time, the interview rooms were not locked, and they would have, the guards would be out in the galleyway, in the passageway, but they could not hear you or anything like that. So you felt like you had some privacy with the client and everything. So yeah.
Might have to be a little nerve-wracking to go, how do you explain this to your wife, saying, hey, guess what I did today? I put myself in harm's way.
Just yeah, well, you deal with it. Yeah.
So what other notables during that time period, were you on the public defender side? Now, before you become a lawyer, you kind of have access. Lafferty, was that one of you?
Michael Lafferty?
Yeah.
I was, I remember the name, but I really was not part of any of that.
These are some of the early matters that we had with John Wart's thing. I don't know if they had public defenders or not. And any other ones that sort of come to mind that are unique experiences where you're...
Well, there was Montgomery Lynch. He was down here in Jamestown. He was charged with killing Percy Graves with a shotgun, but apparently it was over a girl named Cindy. And so Montgomery was in jail. He was in jail, and then they were able to, I think it was Bruce Carpenter who was able to get this plea. And Paul King, did the right thing. It was, as he always did, he was very good in that regard. And he was one of the ones I really looked to, especially when I became an assistant DA. But in any event, he said, look, the evidence shows that Montgomery came in with a shotgun, but that Percy grabbed it and it went off and it killed him. So he gave him reduced the murder charge to a manslaughter 1, and Leetown then sentenced him to 10 years, but right after that, he indicated on the record, and it eventually came to pass in county court, that Montgomery ended up marrying the eyewitness, the girl who that they were fighting over, and who had, I think she had been in protective custody at that time too, if memory serves me. So I was just, so
wow.
Yeah.
So we were going down your chronology, and you find your way going to Akron Law School. I think that's where we stopped.
Correct.
And came back here to Fagan and Sheffield. By the way, just since you're such a contact, Bob Laughlin, Don Brandt are people who are named. You kind of knew about them, but you didn't. Tell me a little bit about those guys.
Oh, Bob was he was a great mentor to me. He was in World War II. He was in the Third Army. He was taken prisoner in the Vosges Mountains towards the end of the war, and he was one of those ones who had escaped from prison, and then the war ended, and then he had to make his way back and everything. And he had a great practice. He was the village attorney. He was a good PI attorney. He did defense work, but shared that with Peter Clark and Steve Terrett at the time. A lot of people felt he shot from the hip, but Maybe he did. But he was very effective, and he really did have a heart of gold. I really did appreciate what he did for me.
Was Bob county attorney for a while?
He was. Yeah, because I almost got to go to work for him, but I wasn't the right party, so that did not bear fruit. So I always joke about how I could have ended up being county executive, because instead of hiring me, he hired Andy Goodell.
Was this the Jack Glenzer time period?
It was, yeah. He worked for Jack.
That's the recollection I have, really,
Yes.
of Bob being county attorney.
Yeah,
Yeah, good.
yeah.
And Don Brandt?
Don Brandt was Fredonia. The only cases I really helped him out, I would watch. He was more corporate, and so he didn't have a lot to do with PI or criminal defense work, but I would watch him in meetings with the grape growers and everything. He was in that type of practice that never seemed to follow me.
Peter Clark was part of the firm then?
Peter Clark, yeah, and he's still practicing.
He is.
Yeah, he still is.
The other day, he's on my short list like you.
Good, because he has some good stories.
Was he as witty then? Or did
He was. He always had these pithy comments. Yeah.
We're sidebarring here for a second, but were you in attendance when they honored those guys that would practice 40 years?
I was.
Were you
Yeah.
one of the honorees? Or
No, God.
That was the funniest evening ever.
Yeah, I enjoyed that
I
time.
filmed most of that too. So
I saw some of it. You just put that on.
Yeah. It's out there for those.
Yeah.
I tried to edit a little bit, but
Yeah. No, I watched that and then went ahead and watched. And, yeah, so it was good. Yeah.
So we digress. And then you, Fagan and Sheffield. So Ed got out of the public sector into the private sector, joined Lanny. Now, were you at the time when Lanny got his bar exam? Did he pass the bar? Because he read for the bar.
He read for the bar, yes. I actually met Lanny after I came back from law school and interviewed, or after I was done with law school, and then I interviewed them. So that was really the first time I had met Lanny. He'd already been an attorney. Yeah.
I just thought that was the most remarkable story, because he was sort of Ed's paralegal, studying for the bar, and then he passed.
Well, he worked for Jeff Weesey.
Excuse me, you're right.
Yes,
Right.
yes. Then he passed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I stand corrected. That's
Yeah.
right. Oh my gosh. Now, Jeff, dropping names here, a character unto himself, was he in the public sector at all? Was he a public defender? What do you think? Or just a defense counsel?
He was pretty much a defense counsel. If he was, it was before my time. I don't have that recollection. So I can't say yay or nay.
And Bruce Carpenter.
Wow.
Original. I mean, we're talking original.
Bruce, a maverick, did things his own way, had his own schedule, but very effective in trial, very good appellate lawyer. He wrote articles, for law reviews and journals, and I think ALR, and every now and then you'd watch him set Judge Adams up for the appeal, and after Adams reacted and made his decision, you could see the recognition come into Judge Adams' eyes and go, he got me. And what can I say? Bruce had been an MP in the Marines. And the story that I hear, Spence Kirschman, who had been chief of police in Lakewood, and then was part-time investigator in the public defenders when I came in, was a Marine sergeant in the same company or squad as Bruce, and this was over in Japan. And Bruce is one day walking down the aisle, the corridor up in the hall, up in the county office building, and Spence sees him, and he doesn't know Spence is even there. And Spence, in his Marine sergeant voice, goes, "Carpenter, attention!" And Bruce does stop, freezes. That's a great story. You know, I don't know if the detail is there, but people, you know, at the time, the attorneys were adversaries, but they had respect for each other, and they were civil to each other. And I always looked upon it as playing a game of one-on-one basketball with your best friend. You don't have to be a best friend, but with someone else, you're not going to give in to them. You're going to play a good game and play as hard as you can, do what you can to win. And if you don't, you still have respect for the other person and all that. And that always carried me through. I observed that, and I always tried to do that. Sometimes I probably wasn't very successful, you know, but you know, you're in a business where there's high emotion, and you do want to win. So.
Was there, we'll talk about collegiality as during the time periods that we were initially talking about was really Judge Adams and then subsequently Judge Ward. Did you guys get together socially? Was the public defender's office and the DA's office? Did you gather with the judge? Was there post-mortems, things like that?
What have you heard?
Just curious.
A
lot of time has lapsed, the statute of limitations.
Well, back in the mid-'70s, I came in after the Peacock Lounge was gone. So, but I had heard a lot of stories about how they would get together and solve cases over a few drinks. The Holland Hotel was still there in Mayville. So I would go there, and Paul King would stop by, Ed Fagan, would be Jim Donovan, who was in the public defender's office. A lot of times I heard Jim and John Ward, who were out in court all the time, in town court, battling each other. They'd then go have a beer. Myself, when I started in the DA office, I had a lot of trials in front of Judge Jackson in the town of Ellicott, and afterwards with Richard Fezenden, who was an assistant public defender, we would retire to a local bar and just, as the judge say, for a glass of milk and discuss things. But it never really affected our trial work, because Richard is just as adversarial in trial as I was. Mm-hmm. And so you really didn't let that affect you. And sometimes people have the wrong image of attorneys. Oh yeah, they're all in cahoots together and all that. That simply was not the case. So.
Now you get out, and now you were at Fagan and Sheffield. At some point you decide you're going to launch yourself either into the public defender, then ultimately assistant DA. Was that the sort of the progress of things?
Well, no, I really never went back to the public defender's office. Okay. Never did. Did private defense work. And then I got a job offer from John Ward in 1984 to do the stop WI prosecutions. So for 2 years plus, I was doing trials, like 4 or 5 trials every week, couple of them jury trials all over the county on nothing but DWIs. And when you do a DWI, you've pretty much done everything. You have to introduce evidence of a technical nature. You have to coordinate witnesses and all that. And so you have a fairly good feeling of, when you get another type of case, what you should do and how it should be presented. And you get a good idea of what the jurors will buy and what they don't buy. And that experience really helped me as I progressed up and eventually became a first assistant and started with the more serious felonies.
When that occurs, how does it, again, you have the police do the arrest. When does the DA's office get engaged? In a normal, early on, scene of the crime, call?
It depends on, obviously, all the homicides. The DA's office is right there. It's called out to a lot of fatalities, a lot of vehicle traffic accidents with serious physical injury, but primarily homicides and deaths. We probably get called almost immediately and are right there on the scene. Sometimes we're not, and then sometimes decisions are made that maybe would have been different, that could impact the long-term result of the case. So, yeah.
So you get right up front. I mean, that's your, and so the case investigation, which ultimately leads to the case development,
correct,
is you're right there, DA's office is there at the get-go.
Correct. For those types of cases.
Right.
I'm not saying for every case. So.
But the ones that get the headlines, and we don't.
Yeah.
Some of the cases, they got a lot of publicity, Paul, and you were involved in that. How does one deal with the press? How did you deal with the press? I mean, there's a curiosity. You work your way through every time there's a court appearance, whether it's an arraignment, whether it's motions, whether it's certainly the trials.
Well, the standards of ethics kind of give you a map of how to perform under those situations. And pretty much, you can't give your own opinion. You don't give out any private information, any information that you think is pertinent. You don't give your opinion, especially, and I just cringe nowadays when I hear some prosecutor give an opinion as to guilt in front of the media. I'm not talking locally. I'm watching CNN or some news report or read something where you see the prosecutor do that, and you just cringe because that's not your job. You can't do that. And you have to maintain a neutral base. So you really have to be very diplomatic in your language, very neutral, and the press knows this. Well, at least they should.
How do you deal with leaks? Sometimes there's evidence which you are not required to disclose, and sometimes it leaks. Was that common, or just a rare instance?
I always said there is really no secret that could be kept. I'd always present a case to the grand jury, a secret indictment, but everyone seemed to know about it. So I don't know. You just roll with the punches and try and minimize the fallout.
Yeah. So. A bunch of cases which Steve Cass and in anticipation of John Ward's event. Just wondering if you were involved in these, Brian Blanco, Debbie Kirshner.
Well, that was, Debbie was the victim, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
Of the city, there was a police officer.
Blanco, I had to deal with in the public defender's office.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was that of note so that why Steve pulled this out?
I don't know. I'm not sure why.
Pre-trial identification procedures were not duly suggested. I don't know why he pulled it out. William Shank against Joe Gerasi, county sheriff.
Yeah, that came back. I was around. I was never part of it, but that came back a few times. Not only in John Ward's time, but Jim's subject as well. Jim finally was able to convince the appellate division that he should be extradited back to Alabama. Yeah.
Reading about it, didn't fully understand it, but it was like 4 or 5 attempts at trying to get him out of here, and then finally it succeeded.
Yeah.
Another one he pulled out was James Lewis.
Oh yeah. September 15th, 1999, he shot Dave Mitchell right in the eye up on Benedict Street. That was a tough time. We didn't know if Dave was going to live or die or anything, and Jim and I were there right from the get-go. I think this happened about 9 o'clock, and he had fled into a house, and they finally got him out of there about 2 o'clock, and he had been shot on his way out. Dave was trying to use him as to get information to help him out in a drug-related case, and he didn't take kindly to that, so he agreed to meet Dave. Unbeknownst to him, though, Dave had picked up Scott DiPietro as a passenger, and as Dave pulled up, Lewis came down with a gun, and as Dave rolled down the window, he shot Dave right in the eye, and I think it was a .357. I think the heat was so great it cauterized everything, so that's why he didn't bleed out. But then once he shot him, Scott bails out of the other side, and that's when Lewis realizes that there's someone else there, and he has run behind the car. He gets to a certain point, and then he does a 90-degree turn, and as he's coming back, he's shooting at Scott, and Scott can't shoot because there's a house in between them running, and the house has got lights on and everything, and so when he clears the house, then he fires, and one shot hits him in the rear, and then he, instead of chasing him, he goes back and calls officer down, and actually I think he saved Dave's life by doing that. And so Scott deserves, one of those shots that Lewis had shot at him was like that far from him. There were bullet holes in the car. And that was one long night. And Dave says that after talking to Dave afterwards, he says, yeah, this happened mid-September. He says he was taken up to ECMC, and next thing he knew, he woke up and saw Doug Flutie running around in the backfield in November, one of the football games and stuff. So Dave had a long process. Yeah. But eventually, a year later, at the trial, testified and everything, and he was convicted, as was he convicted for federal charges as well, so he was sentenced to 50 years here and 50 years in the federal system as well. So.
See David all the time at Lysandro's. That's where you second home.
Yeah.
Buchanan, Ingve Buchanan, was that part of yours?
No, but I watched it. Paul Webb represented him. Charlie represented him. And it was Jim Subject and Billy Coughlin, I believe, that prosecuted him. And so, yeah.
Was Chip, help me through the district attorney process. So John Ward was elevated to judge, and then give me the sequence after that.
Well, then he left, and Jim was elected, and then John took office January 1st, I think 93, and then Jim took office January 1st, 93. So there really was no gap.
And you decided just to stay on?
Oh yeah. I was by then I was a first assistant, and and I like working with Jim as a defense attorney. Jim was just very matter of fact. He told me what he was going to do. I told him what I was going to do, and we'd have these trials. And like I say, it's a one-on-one game of basketball. He beat me a lot. He was good. So I was glad to have someone who could handle himself in a trial situation.
How did the choices be made? So ultimately, obviously, you went on to the DA side, first DA, and somebody's got to say, all right, you're going to do this trial, you're going to do that trial. Is that boardroom where Jim sits down and says, who wants to do this one, or does he actually say, oh, this is yours?
No, a lot of times Jim handled the administration, as did John, but then, the DA is always expected to handle the big cases.
Right.
And everything, and that's pretty much what they did. And so all the assistants would handle their cases that arose within their assigned jurisdictions.
You had Mayville, principally, didn't you? You had the felonies?
I had Jamestown, Ellicott, Bust-I, and all the other town courts, Carroll, Cayentone. Yeah. Don't forget, you'd be in a trial up in Mayville, and then you get home and quick bite, and then go out to Cayentone and Carroll Court for Tuesday night. A lot of times, some trials would start. Well, my record is 4:30 in the morning with a hung jury. You just. And when I was in private practice, I was like an 80% ADA, and then I had my private practice, and then you get out in town court doing a trial until like 1, 2 o'clock at night, and that's usually the usual hours. And then you have to do a closing at 9 o'clock the next morning or something like that.
So I'll get your head rearranged.
Yeah.
We stumbled across guys that were the ADAs for a long period of time, and coming to mind is the Bill Foley's and the Bob Seidel's. Tell me about some of those guys.
When I first started in the public defender's office, this was back in the latter part of 1975, you had Bob Seidel, who did all the Jamestown and Ellicott cases as far as the misdemeanors and the DWI felonies. And Bob and he also is. Don't forget, these are all part-time ADAs because they all had their private practices, and he had his out in Sinclairville. And but he was always in court, in city court, mainly Tuesday and Thursdays, and then in Ellicott courts and everything. Bob was a very quiet guy, but he was very methodical, and you could talk to him about handling cases and trying to get the best deal for your client. And finally, when he says no, then you prepare for trial. And he would go through it in his quiet, methodical way. And he's very effective, I thought, because he was there for years. Let's see, Bill Foley. Oh man, I watched him in a rape trial. Don't forget, Lynn Hartley was an assistant public defender, so I was a trial assistant with him in a rape trial that I think it was one of the last cases he had before he got elected family court judge.
I didn't even remember that.
So it was against, and Bill Foley was presenting the case in front of Judge Adams, and it was a jury, and Bill, very experienced, and he always had that deep voice, and he really did command attention. He was well organized and thought quickly on his feet, and he was a favorite. The jurors liked him and everything. So he mainly was over in Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And I still remember as a defense attorney, I was representing someone as on a DWI there, and I said, well, I'm going to file a notice of claim against the city for the way the police treated him, and thinking that I could use that as some leverage to get at least reduced to an impaired. Bob goes, go ahead, you'll never get a deal. Well, that didn't work out so well for me. And there is Ron Gibb. Ron did the felony stuff up north. He had been an assistant public defender. He and Bill Arison hired me, and then Arison left for Fagan, and then Ron left to go across the hall to the DA office. And I think that was, at the time, was one of the reasons I think Dalby ended up having to do.
It's in the decision,
yeah. So, and Ron actually handled, for many, many years, a lot of the fatalities, the vehicle fatalities and everything. And that was a tough job, dealing with the families and stuff like that. It was just so sad. And let's see. Jim Subject was an assistant DA for a while then. And then he went into private practice and came back out in '93. Rick Goodell was an assistant district attorney until he decided to run against Jim for DA. So didn't see much of Rick after that. I liked working with Rick. Bill Duncanson. He was a good ADA. He did a lot
Senior?
Junior, yeah. Neil Robinson, he had this deep voice, had a good courtroom presence, did a lot of felonies and everything. He was very popular. Darrell Brodigam was an assistant DA. He pretty much decided to go private practice at about the same time I went full-time DA office. I was in private practice for about 10 years, and I just got to the point I couldn't do both. Right. And he got to the point he couldn't do both. So we went our separate ways. But Bill Custer happened to be, during Judge Ward's reign there, he did all the stop DWI cases, and he was a great litigator. I still remember before he came into the DA office, one of my first jury trials was with him. It was a DWI, and it was out in the highway barn in Ellington, and they pulled out the trucks and set up the chairs, and we went at it until about 2:30 in the morning and got a hung jury because his defense was the defendant wasn't operating his vehicle. So couldn't get the jurors to decide on that. And so we were going to be doing another trial, and then the defendant apparently was on a motorcycle, and he had been drinking, I guess, and so got in an accident and became a quadriplegic. So we didn't go through with that. Geez, what? I'm trying to remember other. I don't want to slight anybody here, but someone obvious. I just can't remember anyone at this point.
Was Walt Donovan involved in any of that process, either the public defenders or?
Jim Donovan. Walt. No, he was not. He was neither in. I don't have any memory of him being in the DA office or the public defender's office.
There's public defenders, let's just go to the district attorney. So you're the ADA, and most of the time it's the public defenders is who's on the other side. But sometimes there are private attorneys hired. Who in our bar kind of got a reputation for doing private criminal defense work? Who were they?
Well, afterwards, it was after Ed left the public defender's office for the second time. And he was a good defense attorney. He had Darrell Brodigan. He had John Schober had been in the public defender's office. He's a very good defense attorney. Paul Webb, par excellence. Both of them, actually. Those are the names that readily come to mind. I know I'll wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and say, gee, I should have mentioned so-and-so.
Save the full call.
Save it. Say, just attribute it to senior memory here.
We're both in this together. Are there cases that sort of stand out where you'd say, Greg, we haven't talked about this one yet, whether we're on the defense side or on the prosecution side, that were perhaps unique in its substance or unique in its procedure or just unique?
Well, just because of the emotional content of the one case, it was the Gloria McNeely case. 2.5-year-old daughter scalded to death in the bathtub down on 7th Street here in Jamestown. Paul King presented that case, and they had taken the bathtub out, and I can still see Tony Caprino pushing it down into the courtroom to show everybody. And Ron Gibb was defending, and I was trial assistant to Ron. And our defense that we were trying to present was Gloria she was pregnant. She had fallen asleep. She had put her daughter in the bathtub and then had fallen asleep. And the water heater was faulty. And the daughter kind of fell forward, had a seizure, a Ray syndrome type seizure, and fell forward while in the bathtub and hit the hot water tap that then scalded her. And the way that Ron put this together, he had a daughter about the same age at that time, and went to his house and filled the bathtub and put red dye in it and put his daughter into the position that little Angela was found in. And it really corresponded to the theory that Ron wanted to present. Paul King obviously was opposed to that offer of proof, and Judge Adams ruled with Paul. But aside from that, it was just such a tragic time. And it happened in the fall, and then Gloria's sitting next to me, and each day she's getting more and more pregnant and everything. And by the time the jurors come in and they deliver a verdict of murder in the second degree, that's Paul King cries. And I still remember I think Jim Fox, who was a reporter at that time, has a picture of him leaving the courtroom, dabbing his eyes, crying.
Mm-hmm.
So, but what a tragedy that was. So,
Hallett, were you involved in that at all?
no, that was before
Were you?
me, yeah.
Jim Fox. Rare assignment where he was in the court a lot.
He worked for the Dunkirk Observer, but he was also a stringer for that time. I think it was the Courier Express, and for I think Warren Papers. He was there all the time, and he always had bylines coming out of Mayville. You don't see that nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't see, and he's kind of like a Jack Anderson, investigative reporter type guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did he get access? Did he befriend Leetown Adams?
He would always go around to all the departments. He'd talk to everybody, everything. I was told by people, don't talk to him, don't say anything to him when I was in the public defender's office. But I liked Jim. I mean, I chit-chat with him about stuff and all that. So.
They had a big article when Cindy came back and worked for Judge Adams.
Yeah.
There's a picture of Judge Adams with Cindy. And Jim Fox did this big article in the Observer, you know, first female clerk.
Yeah.
This beautiful,
I remember that. Yeah.
You know, that really kind of, now you're sexist.
Yeah. All the language, yeah.
And is married to her husband, Frank.
Oh,
Of course, they got everybody excited. Who the hell's Frank?
Who the hell's Frank? Well, Jim didn't hear. I think he had hearing aids. Or he did eventually. So.
Well, but he shows up. Are you guarded at all about, you know, are you just doing public courtroom and?
No.
Yeah.
No, a lot of times he's just asking for stuff that he's entitled to anyway, as a member of the public or whatever.
You
so
just knew that it was.
You just don't talk about any of the personal aspects of a case. Yeah.
Well, it was unique. I mean, there's nobody like that now. You might get a murder case that has some post-journal person assigned who has no idea what's going on.
Right.
Let's along those lines. There's did you feel in the DA's office or in the public defender's office a public education component at all to explain what's an indictment, what's an arraignment, what's all that stuff? Did you?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. You're doing that in your voir dire with the jury, trying to explain that. You're doing that when you meet and greet a grand jury panel for the first time. You try and give the highlights and give the overview of how the system works and all that. So yeah, you're always educating.
Both your job, both sides of the process. You're dealing with the personal element. I mean, you got live,
very
emotional, highly charged situations, which normal lawyers, frankly, other than don't get involved. I mean, a little emotional, upbeat now and then, but nothing but you're doing. How did you keep your sanity?
Well, I think back at that time, and I think, God, I'm sure glad we didn't have cell phones or voicemail or anything like that, because I just, you know, you just accept it as part of the human condition, and it's your job, and you try and do the job the best you can. But sometimes it's tragic. Other times it's funny. Things can happen that you can find to be very enjoyable to have experienced.
Give me a for instance of a humor.
I knew you were going to say that. Oh boy. No, I can't. Otherwise, because then you get into human sentiments of No, I better not.
I will accept that.
So,
You at some point decide, I'm moving on and kind of getting out of that public civil servant arrangement. Was that tough? You had a lot of years. How many years did you
no,
have?
I had 23 years as an assistant DA. I went from 84 to 2007, and then because then I was able to use all of that experience and assist Judge Ward. I became his law clerk. Okay, and so I did use all that experience, and working with Judge Ward was great because of all of his experience. And so, well, you always say, in criminal law, you learn something new every day, and there's some aspects you've never touched upon before, but if I hadn't touched upon it, Judge Ward had, and vice versa. So I thought we made a good team.
So your paths did cross really two judges during your career, Adams and Ward. Again, style-wise,
of the judges? Well, don't forget, I worked for Judge Ward twice, once as DA and once as the judge. So I knew his style. And John was always willing to listen to everybody. Judge Adams had his own mind, and he had his mind set and knew what he was going to do. One time there was a case I was trying to argue. It was quite a public case, but I was trying to argue that the individual had to be treated as a persistent felony offender. And so I'm sitting and waiting for the judge to come in, and we rise, and Judge Ward is now the DA, and he's sitting next to me, and he whispers to me, "Now don't get him angry." Okay. So I walk up to the bench and try and make my argument on the motion, because I had made the motion. And I go, "Your Honor." And he just starts off. So he has his own mind made up and everything, but he was a good person to learn under. I mean, he didn't cut me any slack at all in many cases, and so I learned,
Were there other attorneys, without getting, well, I don't know, whatever you want to do? I know Ed Fagan and the judge didn't start off on a good foot at all. Were there others of that ilk that just when you walked into the courtroom, you just kind of knew that Adams' switch went on?
Yes. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, Cindy occasionally tell, but she kept her counsel.
Yeah.
Kept the counsel. So always a curiosity. Off camera, I'll tell you if I haven't already, the Scott Harley story myself.
You told me that.
Oh, did I?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. You won.
Nice. So when you came down here today, you're getting in the car in Lakewood, New York, and you're kind of driving down, and you go, I wonder what Greg's going to ask. Were you thinking about this at all?
Yeah, I was. I was going through my mind and everything, and just revisit. It's kind of like you're going back in your mind to all these memories and feelings and everything, and it's quite a process to go through. So.
What's the question you expected that I haven't even asked you?
How much am I getting paid for this? No, not really.
I'll buy some of your beer.
No, not really. I really, you've pretty much covered a lot of the stuff. It's the human condition, and it's tragic, and it's a necessary process that we have in our justice system that we've developed, and it works in most cases. And just because it doesn't work in a few cases doesn't mean you have to dismantle the whole thing, and doesn't mean you have to redevelop the model. You're always trying to refine it. I'm looking at nowadays what the DA gets paid, what the public defender gets paid, comparing it to what I think the DA got paid back then. Is like not even $25,000-$30,000, and and that was a lot of money back then. So yeah, I just I said it before, I'm just glad I'm now not in the practice with all the voicemail and the social media and stuff like that, because it's hard. And as a DA, as an elected DA, people think it's a very powerful position, but a lot of that is just illusory, because you really are at the whim of people, people's behavior, character, their own agendas and everything. And now it's emphasized more by social media.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough job. It's a stressful job. And sometimes anyone on your staff makes a decision that looks badly, you have to own it.
Mm-hmm.
So
after you left, were you consulted by the DA's office, knowing you were no longer part of it, you're not on the payroll, but did they call and say, Paul, what do you think?
Well, both sides, don't forget, I'm with the judge now, so I'm a neutral party.
I keep forgetting that.
Yeah, so, I would do pre-trials with both DAs and defense attorneys there, and so I would give them the benefit of my experience and my opinion, and pretty much how I thought Judge Ward would think as well. So, yeah, in that category, in that context, yes.
Good.
Yeah.
This has been fabulous, Paul. But you're not going to share your wine recipe. That's not gonna happen. So, Jerry, should you see that? He's saying no. It's not going to happen. You're not coming back.
Jerry and I would trade bottles
Is that right?
initially.
He does that too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, he makes wine too.
Does he?
Oh, you should talk to him about that, some of the stuff he's made.
He brought it up about you.
Yeah,
he
well,
never
no.
fessed up to that.
No.
And you're still riding, he wanted to know if you're still into bicycling?
Yeah, still doing that. Not as much, but still out there.
You did allow us how that you were a serious bike rider. Hard bike rider, you said.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
No, just enjoy getting out, riding with people. So, yeah.
You're a good man, Paul Andrews. Thank you for spending time.
Well,
this is great.
Thank you for whatever it's worth and for whatever you're going to be doing with it. It's
It'd be big.
on the dusty shelf of history here.